Los Angeles, 1947. A city pretending to be alive with hope, even as it quietly rotted from the inside. Neon signs buzzed through the night. Palm trees lined the streets like props on a movie set. Hollywood sold the world a fantasy fame, fortune, and happy endings, but behind the studio gates, dreams died every day. I want you to imagine this city as it was then. A post-war America trying to forget what it had just survived. Soldiers returned home carrying invisible scars. Young women arrived by the busload, chasing screen tests that never came. Everyone believed they were one break away from becoming somebody. Elizabeth Short was one of them. She came to Los Angeles with nothing but hope, a suitcase, and a belief that life could be more than what she had known. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't protected. She was just another face in a city that devoured the forgotten. And yet, in January of 1947, her name would be carved into American history forever. On a quiet morning in a vacant lot, not far from well-kept homes and passing streetcars, something unimaginable waited to be discovered. What was found there would shock police, horrify the public, and permanently stain the image of Hollywood's golden age. The body was staged. The violence was deliberate. The message was unmistakable. This was not a murder meant to be hidden. This was a murder meant to be seen. As newspapers screamed for answers, the city became obsessed. Reporters lied. Witnesses contradicted each other. Suspects appeared and vanished. Confessions poured in, and every single one fell apart. The killer never came forward, and the truth never followed. What remained was a name the media would invent, a name that would eclipse the woman herself. They called her the Black Dahlia. But before she became a headline, before she became a mystery, before she became a symbol of unsolved evil, Elizabeth Short was a real person, a daughter, a dreamer, a young woman who trusted the wrong city at the wrong time. Tonight, I'm not here to retell a legend. I'm here to strip away the myths, the rumors, and the Hollywood lies, and take you back to the beginning, to who Elizabeth Short really was, to how she ended up alone in a city of millions, and to how one of the most brutal murders in American history was committed and never solved. This is the story of a dream that turned into a nightmare. This is the story Los Angeles never wanted told. This is the Black Dahlia Murder. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, a quiet place, far removed from the lights and illusions of Hollywood. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by instability. Her father struggled financially during the Great Depression, and when Elizabeth was still a child, he vanished. His car was found abandoned near a bridge, and the family was left to believe he had taken his own life. Overnight, Elizabeth's world fractured. There was no closure, no explanation, only absence. Her mother was suddenly left alone to raise 5 daughters in a country that was collapsing under economic hardship. Money was scarce, stability was rare, and for Elizabeth, childhood was marked by illness as much as uncertainty. She suffered from severe asthma and recurring bronchial infections, conditions that left her weak and isolated for long stretches of time. Doctors warned that cold weather could worsen her health, quietly suggesting that she might not survive if she stayed where she was. So, while other girls dreamed of futures close to home, Elizabeth was already being pushed away from hers. As a teenager, she was sent to Florida to live with relatives, hoping the warmer climate would ease her breathing. It was there that Elizabeth began to imagine a different version of herself, one not defined by sickness or struggle. She was described as soft-spoken, polite, and deeply private. Despite the rumors that would later surround her name, there was nothing reckless about her. She didn't drink heavily, she didn't cause trouble, she simply wanted more than the life she'd been handed. When Elizabeth eventually learned that her father was still alive, that he had abandoned the family and started over without them, it cut deeper than any illness ever had. Their brief attempts at reconnecting ended badly. Whatever hope she had of belonging somewhere quietly disappeared. And so, like thousands of young women before her, Elizabeth turned her eyes west. Los Angeles represented possibility. It was a place where reinvention was not just allowed, it was encouraged. She imagined herself healthy, independent, maybe even noticed. Not necessarily famous, just seen. But Hollywood had rules no one explained. Elizabeth arrived without money, without connections, and without protection. She moved between friends' couches and cheap rooms, relying on kindness that was never guaranteed. She took small jobs when she could, but nothing lasted. Stability always seemed just out of reach. People noticed her appearance. Her dark hair contrasted sharply with her pale skin. She favored simple clothing, often dark in color, more practical than stylish. Later, newspapers would exaggerate this into something sinister, but in reality, Elizabeth was trying to blend in, not stand out. Those who knew her described her as gentle, shy, someone who trusted too easily. She spoke about acting, but never claimed success. She wasn't living a glamorous life, she was surviving. And yet, in a city that devoured anonymity, Elizabeth Short remained painfully visible. She was alone more often than she admitted, drifting through a place that promised everything and delivered almost nothing. Each day carried the quiet pressure of needing somewhere to sleep, someone to rely on, and a future that never quite arrived. She had no idea that her name would soon be torn from her and replaced with a headline, that her life would be reduced to speculation, that her face would become more famous in death than it ever was in life. At this point in her story, Elizabeth Short was still alive, still hoping, still believing that Los Angeles might eventually give her what it had taken from so many others. She had no way of knowing that the city she trusted was already preparing to erase her. By the beginning of January 1947, Elizabeth Short was running out of places to go. Los Angeles had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent in the worst possible way. She moved carefully through the city, carrying her belongings lightly, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. Each night depended on favors. Each morning began with uncertainty. People who crossed her path during those final days would later remember small, ordinary details. They remembered her politeness, her quiet voice, the way she tried not to impose. Nothing about her behavior suggested fear, or that she believed she was in danger. If anything, she seemed tired physically and emotionally, like someone who had been waiting too long for life to begin. On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth was seen inside the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. It was a place that symbolized everything she wanted and everything she didn't have. The lobby was busy with businessmen, tourists, and well-dressed couples. Elizabeth sat alone, positioned where she could see the entrance, as if she were waiting for someone to arrive. No one knows who that person was. Witnesses later said she appeared calm, not anxious, not distressed. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't rushing. She was simply waiting patiently, deliberately, as though she believed that whoever she was expecting would change something. That moment, frozen in time, would become the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. What happened after she left the Biltmore has never been fully reconstructed. There were no verified witnesses, no receipts, no trail that police could confidently follow. She seemed to vanish into the city the same way she had arrived, quietly and without notice. Over the next several days, Elizabeth's absence went unnoticed. No missing person report was filed. No alarm was raised. In a city full of transients and broken routines, disappearance was easy. She had no permanent address, no employer waiting for her return, no one checking in. Somewhere during that window of time, Elizabeth encountered the person who would end her life. Whether she trusted them, whether she resisted, whether she even understood what was happening, those answers were taken from her. All that remains is the certainty that what followed was not quick, and it was not accidental. She did not die immediately. Investigators would later determine that she was held for an extended period. She was restrained, moved, controlled. The isolation she had lived with for so long became absolute. And while the city continued on, streetcars running, radios playing, people laughing inside warm rooms, Elizabeth Short was being erased, piece by piece, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 6 days passed. 6 days where no one was looking for her. 6 days where the person responsible believed they would never be caught. By the time the city would notice Elizabeth Short again, she would no longer be a missing woman. She would be a crime scene. And the quiet loneliness that defined her final days would be replaced by something far louder, something that would echo through Los Angeles and across the country for decades to come. The morning of January 15th, 1947, began like any other in Los Angeles. The sky was clear. The air was cool. Children were walking to school. Streetcars rattled past neighborhoods that looked peaceful from the outside. Nothing about that day suggested it would become one of the most infamous dates in American criminal history. In the Leimert Park neighborhood, a vacant lot sat quietly between rows of modest homes. It was a place people passed without noticing, an empty stretch of land used occasionally as a shortcut, never as a destination. That morning, a local woman named Betty Bersinger walked through the area with her young daughter. She had no reason to be alert, no reason to be afraid. Then she saw something in the grass. At first, it didn't register as human. From a distance, it looked artificial, something discarded, something unreal. A mannequin, maybe. That was the thought that crossed her mind as she continued walking. But as she got closer, the shape didn't make sense. The angles were wrong. The stillness was wrong. And then she understood. What lay in that vacant lot was the body of a young woman severed cleanly into 2 pieces at the waist. The upper and lower halves were placed apart from each other, deliberately arranged. Her arms were positioned above her head. Her legs were spread. The body was posed, not abandoned. Elizabeth Short had been displayed. There was no blood pooling beneath her, no signs of struggle in the dirt. Her skin appeared pale, almost wax-like, as though life had been drained long before she was brought there. The body had been washed, cleaned, prepared. Her face bore the most disturbing detail of all. A deep, deliberate cut stretched from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, a grotesque carving that transformed her expression into something permanently frozen between pain and mockery. It wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It was intentional. Betty Bersinger ran. Police were called. And within minutes, the illusion of normalcy in that neighborhood collapsed. Officers arrived to a scene unlike anything they had encountered before. This wasn't a crime committed in panic. This wasn't an act of sudden violence. Everything about the placement suggested control, precision, planning. Detectives quickly realized the murder had not occurred there. There was no blood trail, no evidence of a struggle. Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else and transported after death. As the scene drew crowds, something irreversible happened. Curious onlookers gathered. Reporters arrived almost immediately. The area was trampled. Evidence was compromised before investigators could fully secure it. The case was already slipping through their fingers. Police photographed the body where it lay, images that would later become infamous. The contrast was chilling, a peaceful residential neighborhood framing one of the most brutal murders Los Angeles had ever seen. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had no identification on her, no purse, no clues left behind to explain who had done this or why. Whoever killed her had taken everything that might have pointed back to them and then left her where she could not be ignored. This was not a killer trying to escape detection. This was a killer demanding attention. By the end of the day, the city was buzzing with fear. Newspapers rushed to press. Radio broadcasts interrupted programming. Los Angeles residents locked their doors a little tighter that night, knowing something had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The body was removed. The lot was cleared. Life, on the surface, continued. But something had changed. Because from that moment on, Elizabeth Short was no longer just a missing young woman. She was a symbol of calculated violence. And somewhere in the city, the person responsible was watching the reaction unfold silent, unknown, and still free. When Elizabeth Short's body reached the coroner's office, the horror of what had been done to her only deepened. What the public had seen in newspapers was already disturbing, but what the autopsy revealed told a far more unsettling story. This was not a quick killing. It was not accidental, and it was not impulsive. Elizabeth had been dead for several hours before she was discovered, yet her body showed unmistakable signs that she had endured prolonged suffering. The coroner determined that she had been tortured for days before her death. Her injuries were extensive and methodical, suggesting a killer who was not rushed, not panicked, and not afraid of being interrupted. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, clear impressions that indicated she had been restrained. She had been bound, helpless, unable to escape. Bruising across her body showed evidence of repeated blows, particularly to the head and face. One of the most severe injuries, a deep laceration across her mouth, stretching from ear to ear, had been inflicted while she was still alive. This grotesque wound, later sensationalized by the press, was not just violence. It was deliberate mutilation. Her body had been completely drained of blood. That detail alone changed everything. There was no blood at the crime scene in Lamert Park, which meant Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else entirely. The killer had washed her body clean, removing any trace of evidence he could. This was not something an ordinary criminal would think to do. It required time, privacy, and control. Then there was the cut. Elizabeth's body had been severed cleanly at the waist, not through bone, but through cartilage precisely, expertly. Medical examiners noted that the incision resembled a surgical procedure known as a hemicorporectomy. This was not guesswork. This was skill. Whoever did this knew anatomy, knew where to cut, knew how to do it without hesitation. That realization sent a chill through investigators. This suggested a killer with medical training, or at the very least, someone with extensive knowledge of the human body. A doctor, a surgeon, a mortician, or someone who had practiced. The official cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging and shock, caused by blunt force trauma and extreme blood loss. In other words, Elizabeth did not die instantly. Her body shut down after enduring unbearable pain. And yet, even after death, the killer wasn't finished. Her body had been posed. Her arms were placed above her head. Her legs were spread. The positioning was deliberate, almost theatrical, as if the killer wanted her to be found exactly this way. As if the vacant lot had been chosen not out of convenience, but for visibility. This wasn't a murder meant to disappear. It was a murder meant to be discovered. Every detail of the autopsy pointed to the same conclusion. This crime was controlled, calculated, and deeply personal. There was no evidence of sexual assault in the traditional sense, which only added to the confusion. This was not about desire. It was about domination, about power, about erasing someone completely. The coroner's report stripped away any lingering illusions that Elizabeth Short had died quietly or quickly. It revealed a killer who had time, privacy, knowledge, and an unsettling level of calm. Someone who could walk away afterward and blend back into society without leaving a trace. As investigators read through the findings, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not the work of an amateur, and whoever did this had likely done something like it before or would do so again. But despite the brutality laid bare by the autopsy, the most haunting detail wasn't what was found. It was what was missing. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, no witnesses, no suspects tied conclusively to the crime. Elizabeth Short had been reduced to evidence on a table, and even then, she refused to give up the identity of her killer. The city wanted answers. The autopsy provided horror but no justice. And as the report reached police headquarters, Los Angeles began to realize something terrifying. They were not hunting a monster from the shadows. They were hunting someone intelligent, disciplined, and invisible. Someone who had already vanished. What happened next was almost as damaging as the murder itself. Within hours of Elizabeth Short's body being discovered, the crime scene was no longer just a police investigation. It had become a spectacle. Reporters crowded the streets. Camera flashes lit up the vacant lot. Details that should have remained confidential were leaked, exaggerated, and in some cases, completely fabricated. Los Angeles was hungry for a story, and the press fed it relentlessly. Newspapers raced each other for exclusives, often publishing information before police could verify it. The brutality of the crime was sensationalized in graphic detail, not to inform, but to shock. Headlines screamed about mutilation, torture, and mystery, transforming Elizabeth from a victim into a morbid form of entertainment. It was the media that gave her the name, the Black Dahlia. Inspired by a recent noir film and fueled by rumors about her appearance, the nickname spread like wildfire. It sounded dramatic, dangerous, marketable, and once it caught on, it completely replaced her real identity. Elizabeth Short disappeared behind it. The woman who had once been quiet, sickly, and hopeful was now portrayed as something else entirely. Newspapers painted her as promiscuous, reckless, and morally corrupt. They suggested she lived a secret life filled with crime and scandal. None of it was proven. Much of it was untrue. But it didn't matter. The narrative had already been decided. As the press shaped public perception, police were overwhelmed. Thousands of tips poured in from across the country. Sightings, accusations, wild theories. Each one demanded attention, draining resources and time. Then came the confessions. Men began calling police stations, claiming responsibility for the murder. Some were mentally ill. Others wanted attention. A few knew just enough details to sound convincing details they could have learned from the newspapers themselves. Every confession collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, reporters crossed lines that would be unthinkable today. They contacted Elizabeth's mother, pretending Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, just to extract personal information before revealing the truth of her daughter's death. It was cruel, it was calculated, and it was devastating. Evidence that should have been protected was compromised. Witnesses read stories before giving statements. Crime scene photos circulated freely. The boundary between fact and fiction blurred beyond repair. The investigation was no longer happening in private. It was unfolding in real time, in public, under pressure, and under scrutiny. And somewhere in Los Angeles, the person responsible was watching the headlines, watching the chaos, watching the truth drown beneath rumor and spectacle. The Black Dahlia murder had become bigger than Elizabeth Short, bigger than justice, bigger than the police themselves. What began as a search for a killer was now a media frenzy spiraling out of control, one that ensured the case would never be clean again, and perhaps never be solved. By the time the noise faded, the damage was already done. And the killer had disappeared into it. Not long after Elizabeth Short's body was discovered, something unsettling began to happen. While police were still struggling to understand the crime scene, while the city drowned in rumors and fear, the killer made a move of his own. On January 24th, 1947, 9 days after the murder, a strange package arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner. It was addressed carefully, deliberately, as though the sender wanted to be absolutely certain it would be opened by the right hands. Inside the package were Elizabeth Short's personal belongings: her birth certificate, her social security card, photographs, an address book, business cards, letters. Every item had been washed clean, scrubbed, until not a single fingerprint remained. It was instantly clear that whoever sent the package had intimate knowledge of the investigation. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a random taunt. This was proof. Proof that the killer had been close to Elizabeth. Proof that he had possession of her things. Proof that he was watching. Tucked inside the package was a note, made from cut-out letters pasted together, like something torn from a nightmare. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The message wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was calm, controlled, almost polite. And that was what terrified investigators the most. Over the following weeks, more letters arrived, each one mocking the police, each one dangling the promise of answers, while offering none. The sender referred to Elizabeth only by the name the media had given her, the Black Dahlia, as if embracing the myth that had already begun to replace the woman. One letter suggested the killer planned to turn himself in. Another promised details. None delivered. Every time police believed they were close, the trail went cold again. Handwriting experts analyzed the notes. Postal routes were traced. Thousands of tips poured in. But the letters led nowhere. And with every passing day, the killer grew bolder not by acting again, but by remaining silent. Because silence, in this case, was power. The letters proved something critical. This murder wasn't just about killing Elizabeth Short. It was about control, about spectacle, about forcing an entire city to pay attention while holding the truth just out of reach. Police debated whether releasing information about the letters had been a mistake. Some believed the publicity encouraged the killer. Others feared he might escalate if ignored. But by then, the damage was done. The killer had successfully inserted himself into the narrative. He was no longer just a suspect. He was a presence. And as the investigation dragged on, the letters stopped. No explanation, no final confession, no closure, just absence. The belongings were all that remained, objects stripped of warmth, stripped of fingerprints, stripped of meaning. Items that once belonged to a living woman, now reduced to evidence in a case slipping further out of reach. Elizabeth Short had been silenced, but her killer had spoken. And then, just as suddenly, he disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions, fear, and a city that would never feel entirely safe again. As the shock of the murder settled into something colder and more permanent, the investigation began to drift into darker territory. With no clear suspect and no solid physical evidence, police turned to what they had left: names, rumors, and shadows. Over time, more than 150 individuals would be questioned in connection to Elizabeth Short's murder. Most were dismissed, a few lingered, and some would haunt the case for decades. The problem was never a lack of suspects. It was the absence of certainty. Some men came forward on their own, confessing to the crime in dramatic detail. They spoke of jealousy, obsession, even love. But when detectives compared their stories to the evidence, each confession collapsed. Dates didn't line up. Details were wrong. Facts had been copied straight from newspapers. These were not killers. They were attention seekers, drifters, or deeply troubled individuals desperate to be connected to something infamous. Others were closer, too close. Doctors were scrutinized early on. The precision of Elizabeth's injuries suggested medical knowledge, someone who understood anatomy, someone who knew how to cut cleanly, efficiently, without hesitation. Surgeons, medical students, dentists, anyone with access to surgical tools became a potential suspect. Yet none could be definitively tied to the crime. Hollywood itself was not spared. Rumors spread of wealthy men, studio insiders, and powerful figures whose names were quietly shielded from the press. Elizabeth had moved in and out of social circles that blurred the line between opportunity and exploitation. She knew people who knew people. In a city built on secrets, that alone was dangerous. One suspect, more than any other, would eventually dominate conversations about the case. Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was a well-connected physician living in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. He was wealthy, intelligent, and deeply eccentric. Police considered him suspicious enough to secretly wiretap his home, hoping to catch a confession. What they recorded was chilling but inconclusive. In one conversation, Hodel was overheard saying something that would echo through true crime history. He suggested that even if he had killed Elizabeth Short, there would be no way to prove it. To some, it sounded like a confession. To others, like the ramblings of an arrogant man who enjoyed provoking fear. Still, nothing concrete followed. No murder weapon was found. No witness placed him with Elizabeth. And in a case already buckling under its own weight, suspicion alone was not enough. As years passed, new names surfaced. Some came from amateur detectives, others from retired police officers reopening old files. Each theory claimed to finally solve the case. Each promised answers. And each fell apart. What became increasingly clear was this: the killer understood something crucial. He understood timing. He understood police procedure. And he understood how to disappear. Elizabeth Short was not chosen at random, but neither was her killer reckless. Whoever committed this crime planned it carefully, executed it methodically, and left nothing behind that could easily be traced. No fingerprints, no blood trail, no reliable eyewitnesses, just a body and a message. As the years turned into decades, many of the original suspects died. Evidence deteriorated, memories faded. The case slipped from active investigation into historical obsession. What remained were questions. Was the killer someone Elizabeth trusted? Someone she met by chance? Someone powerful enough to avoid scrutiny? Or someone who walked away unnoticed, blending back into a city that protected anonymity better than any accomplice ever could? The truth is unsettling, but unavoidable. The Black Dahlia murderer was never caught, not because he wasn't suspected, but because he was never proven. And in the absence of proof, justice remained out of reach. Elizabeth Short became frozen in time, while the person who destroyed her life vanished into history, leaving behind only theories, accusations, and a mystery that refuses to die. By the time weeks turned into months, and months stretched into years, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The Black Dahlia investigation was no longer moving forward. It was sinking under its own weight. Not because there were no suspects, not because there were no leads, but because the case had been overwhelmed from the very beginning. The crime scene itself had already been compromised within hours. Before detectives could fully process what they were looking at, photographers, reporters, and curious onlookers crowded the vacant lot. Evidence was disturbed. Footprints were destroyed. Potential clues vanished into the soil beneath dozens of shoes. What should have been preserved became spectacle. And the media made sure of that. Newspapers competed aggressively, publishing graphic details that should never have been released. They invented timelines, exaggerated Elizabeth Short's personal life, and framed her not as a victim, but as a scandal. Each headline fueled public obsession, and with it came an avalanche of false information. Tips flooded police stations by the thousands. Some were honest. Many were delusional. Others were malicious. Detectives chased rumor after rumor, burning time and resources on stories that collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. Every dead end diluted the focus of the investigation. Then came the confessions. Men from across the country began claiming responsibility for the murder. Some were mentally ill. Some were seeking attention. Others were hoping for notoriety. Each confession demanded investigation, and each one fell apart. But the damage was already done. Real leads were buried beneath theatrical lies. The technology of the era offered little help. DNA analysis did not exist. Fingerprint records were incomplete. Surveillance cameras were non-existent. The killer had operated in a narrow window of time, in a city teeming with people, and vanished into anonymity. But the failures didn't end there. Internal politics within the Los Angeles Police Department slowed progress even further. Pressure mounted from city officials who wanted the case solved quickly or forgotten quietly. As public interest grew more volatile, mistakes were covered up rather than corrected. Evidence was mishandled. Files were misplaced. Witness statements contradicted one another without resolution. And hovering above it all was fear. Fear that the killer was intelligent. Fear that he understood anatomy. Fear that he might belong to a class of people no one wanted to accuse. Hollywood connections were whispered about. Wealth was hinted at. Influence loomed quietly in the background. And whether those suspicions were justified or not, they created hesitation, an unspoken boundary investigators were reluctant to cross. As years passed, witnesses aged, memories faded, suspects died. The case grew colder with each passing decade, until it became less of an investigation and more of a legend. A file that was revisited, reinterpreted, and reimagined but never resolved. Elizabeth Short's murder did not remain unsolved because no one cared. It remained unsolved because too many voices spoke at once. Too much truth was buried beneath noise. and too many chances were lost in the critical hours when answers still existed. What should have been a methodical pursuit of justice instead became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when a crime becomes entertainment, when a victim becomes a headline, and when the need for spectacle overtakes the search for truth. By the time the city moved on, the killer already had, and Elizabeth Short was left behind, trapped forever inside a mystery the world created around her. More than 75 years have passed since Elizabeth Short was found in that vacant Los Angeles lot, and yet her presence has never truly left. Her murder did not fade into obscurity. It embedded itself into the cultural bloodstream of America, becoming something far larger than the crime itself. Over time, Elizabeth Short stopped being seen as a young woman with a life, a past, and fragile dreams. She became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a shadow cast over Hollywood's golden age. Her name, no longer even her real name, was repeated endlessly: the Black Dahlia. It appeared in newspaper headlines, crime novels, films, television shows, and late-night conversations, whispered with fascination rather than empathy. Each retelling sharpened the myth and dulled the truth. The brutality of her death became entertainment. The mystery became a commodity. And somewhere along the way, Elizabeth Short disappeared. Hollywood continued to sell dreams, but the Black Dahlia became proof of what happened to those who didn't make it. She was portrayed as reckless, immoral, and dangerous, labels that made her fate easier to accept. If she was irresponsible, then what happened to her could be dismissed as inevitable. But those who actually knew her told a different story. A quiet girl, polite, gentle, someone who trusted the wrong people in a city that thrived on exploitation. Her murder also changed the way America consumed crime. This was one of the first cases where the media didn't just report the story, they shaped it. Sensationalism replaced restraint. Rumors were printed as facts. Graphic details were used to sell papers. And the public, hungry for answers, devoured every word. The line between journalism and spectacle was permanently blurred. Law enforcement learned a hard lesson as well. The Black Dahlia case exposed how unprepared police departments were for crimes of this scale and complexity. Evidence handling, media control, and interdepartmental communication all failed. Mistakes made in this investigation would later influence reforms in homicide investigations across the country. Yet none of that brought justice. Elizabeth Short's case remains officially unsolved. No arrest, no conviction, no closure. The killer, whoever he was, vanished into history, leaving behind nothing but questions and theories that grow colder with time. What endures is the discomfort. The knowledge that someone capable of such calculated violence was never held accountable. The realization that a life could be erased so completely, yet remembered so inaccurately. The understanding that fame, even in death, offers no protection, only exposure. Elizabeth Short wanted to be seen. Instead, she was consumed. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats victims, especially young women without power or status. It asks whether we are more interested in mysteries than in humanity, whether we remember names or only headlines. And in the quiet moments, when the speculation fades and the myths fall away, what remains is a single, unresolved question that time has never answered. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Until that question is answered, if it ever is, the Black Dahlia will remain more than a cold case. She will remain a reminder of ambition, of cruelty, of a city that promised everything and delivered something unforgivable. And somewhere beneath the layers of legend, Elizabeth Short still waits to be remembered, not as a mystery, but as a person. More than 75 years have passed since Elizabeth Short was found in that empty Los Angeles lot, yet the questions surrounding her death remain as sharp as they were in 1947. Evidence has aged, witnesses have died, suspects have faded into history, but the silence surrounding her killer has never truly settled. Over time, the Black Dahlia case stopped being just an investigation. It became a legend, a story retold so many times that the truth blurred with myth. Hollywood turned it into entertainment. Newspapers turned it into spectacle. The public turned it into obsession. And somewhere along the way, Elizabeth Short disappeared. Not the body found in the grass, but the woman herself. The young girl from Massachusetts who battled illness. The daughter who was abandoned. The dreamer who believed a city built on illusions might finally give her a place to belong. She was reduced to a nickname, a headline, a crime scene photograph. The failure to solve her murder wasn't just about missing evidence or outdated forensic science. It was about a system overwhelmed by chaos, corrupted by attention, and pressured by a city desperate to protect its image. Too many leads, too much noise, too little patience for the truth. And perhaps that's what makes this case so disturbing. The killer didn't just get away with murder, he disappeared into the very fabric of Los Angeles. He lived among ordinary people. He walked the same streets. He watched the headlines grow, knowing his secret was safe. Elizabeth never got that luxury. She never got justice. She never got closure. And she never got to tell her own story. Instead, we are left with fragments, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, confessions that led nowhere, suspects that raised more questions than answers. A mystery so vast that even today, investigators can't agree on where the truth might be hiding. The Black Dahlia murder endures not because of its brutality alone, but because it represents something far larger. It exposes how easily the vulnerable can be lost, how quickly truth can be buried beneath spectacle, and how some crimes don't just haunt a family, they haunt an entire city. Elizabeth Short came to Los Angeles looking for a future. What she found was silence. And until the day her killer is named, if that day ever comes, the Black Dahlia will remain not just a cold case, but a warning. A reminder that even in places built on dreams, darkness can thrive unnoticed. This is not just an unsolved murder. This is a story of justice denied. And it is a story that refuses to end.